Hello, this is Brian Thompson, CEO of Pizzaply Media, and therefore executive producer of Evidence File. By the time Evidence File ended its first season a short while ago, it had become one of the top true crime podcasts on the True Crime Podcast charts. In terms of Pizzaply Media, it was second in listeners only to our flagship program, Whatever Happened to Pizza at McDonald's. Unfortunately, shortly before we were set to launch Season 2, the Evidence File family suffered a terrible loss. The host of Evidence File, an anonymous Australian man, was found dead. Thankfully, though, we quickly hired a new host, a second anonymous Australian man. And I believe you will hear in this Season 2 premiere that he is fully capable of maintaining the high standard of quality true crime podcast fans have come to expect from this show. If you are not already subscribed to Pizzaply Media's Evidence File, I encourage you to do so on wherever you get your podcasts. This season is sure to set a new standard of true crime podcast excellence. Thank you for listening. Thank you to the former anonymous Australian host. And thank you to the new anonymous Australian host, whoever you may be.
Today's episode of Evidence File deals with crime. If you find crime disturbing, please seek professional help. In January of the year 2023, everyone on the top side of the earth was bundled up in their warmest bundles and huddled together in their huddle huts to avoid the frigid blizzards raging outside. But as blisteringly cold as it felt in the northern hemisphere, it was equally blisteringly hot on the world's undercarriage. Here lay Australia, the mysterious landmass that can't decide whether it's a continent or a country. One of its most notable residents was an anonymous Australian man who hosted a popular true crime podcast called Evidence File. The anonymous Australian man had worked very hard to achieve his lofty position as one of the top podcasters in his field. Yes, it's true that podcasting is one of the lowest art forms. Thus, being one of the most well-regarded podcasters was a bit like being the prettiest earthworm wriggling in the wet dirt underneath a rotting log. But the anonymous Australian man had earned his position at the top of the true crime podcast charts by diligently looking up Wikipedia articles about horrible crimes and then reading those Wikipedia articles into a microphone. He had also earned quite a bit of money. It seemed like every successful company on earth was desperate to access the lucrative true crime podcast audience. If there's one thing these people love even more than hearing podcast hosts read Wikipedia articles about horrible crimes, it's using coupon codes. The anonymous Australian man opened his banking app every day and watched with delight as his account grew larger and larger. One time, he received such a huge deposit from the healthy breakfast cereal subscription company Magic Spoon that his bank had telephoned him to make sure it wasn't some kind of mistake. He explained to the bank operator that it was no mistake at all. He was simply one of the top true crime podcasters in the world. The bank operator recognized his voice. She asked him if he was the anonymous Australian man who hosted the show Evidence File. The anonymous Australian man suddenly tensed up. This bank operator had access to his personal information. If he confirmed that he was the anonymous host of Evidence File, he would no longer be anonymous. He quickly made up a lie and said he wasn't the anonymous host of Evidence File. He said he was actually a guest host on the show My Favorite Murder, and that he filled in for regular host Karen Kilgariff whenever she had to run some errands. The bank operator pretended to believe the anonymous Australian man was telling the truth, but he knew she probably saw right through him. He made a mental note to use his extensive knowledge of true crime to figure out a way to have her murdered without implicating himself in the act. It was so swelteringly hot outside on this January day that the anonymous Australian man decided he should stay inside his air-conditioned house and marathon some episodes of Dateline NBC. The only problem was that his sofa was old and uncomfortable and completely unsuited for such an extended session of television watching. So the anonymous Australian man went to the sofa store with a mind toward using some of his advertising revenue to purchase a new sofa. He chose the most expensive and luxurious one available. It was made out of 100% locally sourced kangaroo leather. That night, the anonymous Australian man was entering the 7th hour of his Dateline NBC marathon, comfortably nestled in the cushy middle seat of his new kangaroo leather sofa. It was still very hot in his house, despite the best efforts of his air conditioner. But he was enjoying all these fascinating episodes of Dateline NBC. The thought occurred to him that if he ever ran out of Wikipedia articles about horrible crimes, maybe he could keep doing his podcast by reading transcripts of episodes of Dateline NBC about horrible crimes. It was such a good idea that he decided he should write it down in his Good Ideas notebook. But when he tried to stand up and retrieve his Good Ideas notebook from his safe, the anonymous Australian man found himself unable to move. The oppressive January heat had made his sweaty skin stick to the kangaroo leather covering his new sofa. He tried and tried to tug himself free. First his arms, then his legs, then his torso, and on down to both of his buttocks. But it was no use. He was trapped. The next thing he knew, the anonymous Australian man was dead. You're doing everything you can do to protect yourself. You've installed 17 deadbolts on your front door. You've installed a Ring camera on every flat surface in your home. If a stranger ever steps on your porch, you shoot them in the chest with a shotgun. But despite every reasonable precaution you take against being brutally murdered, all your friends and loved ones still insist you're suffering from extreme, self-destructive paranoia. With BetterHelp, you no longer have to sit in your panic room wondering if they may be right. BetterHelp offers thousands of licensed, professional therapists well equipped to tell you whether or not you're really suffering from paranoid delusions. Even better, BetterHelp's best-in-class vetting procedures guarantee your therapist probably isn't in cahoots with all the people conspiring against you. For 5% off your first BetterHelp therapy session, use the coupon code HORRIBLECRIMES. "56-year-old Topher Gopher was in a desperate financial situation. For the past several years, his high-end couch business, Topher Gopher's Luxury Sofas, had been losing money. In these tough economic times, people were cutting back on unnecessary expenses wherever they could. And the first sacrifice was usually very expensive furniture. When the anonymous Australian host of Evidence File entered his sofa store on that hot January day, Topher Gopher was eager to make a sale. He immediately determined this was a customer who could afford the most expensive luxury kangaroo leather couch on the showroom floor. The anonymous Australian host was clearly a man of great wealth, since he was wearing a false nose of impeccable craftsmanship and a bright green wig so lustrous that it had to be made from only the finest human hair. "Welcome to Topher Gopher's Luxury Sofas," said Topher Gopher. "That's a really nice false nose and wig you're wearing." The anonymous Australian host spoke in a high-pitched squeal to disguise his voice. "Thank you," he squealed. "I wear these things to conceal my identity, since I'm the anonymous host of the hit podcast Evidence File." Topher Gopher had never listened to a podcast. As a person who values his time on Earth, he preferred to entertain himself by reading books or playing with his children. But it's not like he was living under a proverbial rock. Like most other people who paid attention to the news, Topher Gopher knew true crime podcast hosts were rolling in money. All he had to do was look out his shop window to see the gleaming mansion on top of the city's tallest hill. It had recently been purchased for over 200 million Australian dollars to be used as a summer home by my favorite murder co-host, Karen Kilgariff. "What's the most luxurious sofa you have?" asked the anonymous Australian host. Topher Gopher explained that his most luxurious sofa was one made out of 100% authentic kangaroo leather. To prove it was real kangaroo, he showed the anonymous Australian host photos of the hunting trip where he personally killed all 27 kangaroos used to make the sofa. The anonymous Australian host thought this was pretty interesting, until they got to the photos of Topher Gopher stringing up the kangaroos by their feet and pulling off their skins. "What's the matter?" Topher Gopher asked. "You look a little green." The anonymous Australian host swallowed a mouthful of vomit and said, "Oh, nothing's the matter. That looks like a really comfortable material to sit on. Do you take credit cards?" Topher Gopher replied that yes, he did indeed take credit cards. But in order to use one, the anonymous Australian host would have to show an ID. "Would a fake ID do?" the anonymous Australian host asked. "You know, because I'm anonymous." Topher Gopher thought about this for a long moment. It was certainly against store policy, but he was desperate to make the sale. Especially for a sofa this luxurious and expensive. He told the anonymous Australian host that a fake ID would be fine. But while he was writing up the order, Topher Gopher realized there was a piece of paperwork all purchasers of kangaroo leather sofas were supposed to sign. Especially in hot January months like this, kangaroo leather had a tendency to become quite sticky when exposed to sweaty human flesh. If a person with damp skin sat on the material long enough, it was likely they would become permanently stuck. This wasn't usually a problem for Topher Gopher, since he had anyone buying a kangaroo leather sofa sign a waiver indemnifying him from all legal responsibility in the event the sweaty sitter became stuck. But with money being as tight as it was for Topher Gopher's luxury sofas, Topher had been avoiding buying new ink for his printer. Consequently, he couldn't print out the waiver. But he figured it would be fine just this once to let it go. After all, the anonymous Australian host probably wouldn't sign his real name anyway. And besides, someone as knowledgeable as a true crime podcaster who reads Wikipedia articles into a microphone surely knew enough about the qualities of kangaroo leather not to sit on the sofa for an extended period of time on a particularly hot day. Later that night, Topher Gopher was sweeping the store after closing time and noticed something strange lying on the floor. It was the anonymous Australian host's false nose. Topher Gopher couldn't help but feel somewhat responsible for the anonymous Australian host having left it behind. He was so excited to make the sale, he must have shaken the anonymous Australian host's hand a little too vigorously, causing the false nose to fall off. Topher Gopher knew he couldn't live with himself if the anonymous Australian host went out without his false nose and was recognized by a crazed fan who shot him dead on sight out of some kind of disturbed psychosexual obsession. The only problem was he didn't know how to get in touch with the anonymous Australian host, since he'd only given the fake name on his fake ID. He asked one of his delivery drivers where they had taken the kangaroo leather couch. The driver said the anonymous Australian host wouldn't give them an address. In fact, he asked that the delivery driver wear a blindfold all the way there while the anonymous Australian host walked backward in front of the truck and shouted so the driver could follow the sound of his voice. But after a few failed attempts to get the sofa through the front door sideways, the driver was allowed to briefly take off his blindfold. He said he couldn't see any numbers on the house, but he was pretty sure it was right next door to Karen Kilgariff's mansion. Topher Gopher knew exactly where the anonymous Australian host must live. Just beside the tall hill where Karen Kilgariff's mansion stood, there was a slightly shorter hill with a slightly smaller mansion on top. It was the kind of place that only a true crime podcaster could afford. He drove to the home and rang the doorbell with the false nose in hand. As soon as he did, he heard a scream coming from inside. From the squealing tone, he recognized the voice as belonging to the anonymous Australian host. "Help! Help!" the anonymous Australian host shouted. "I'm stuck to this kangaroo leather couch. Topher Gopher peered through the window and, to his horror, saw that what the anonymous Australian host was squealing was true. Try as he might to move his arms, his legs, his torso, or even both his buttocks, the anonymous Australian host couldn't move an inch. And Topher Gopher knew he never would again. Once a sweaty person becomes stuck to kangaroo leather, there's no way to unstick them without the complete surgical removal of the affected skin. In all the years he'd been dealing in luxurious kangaroo leather sofas, Topher Gopher had only known of 2 people who survived the procedure. And for the rest of their lives, both of them looked really, really gross. He mentally kicked himself for not having the anonymous Australian host sign the waiver, but now there was nothing he could do. Whether he left the anonymous Australian host to die of thirst or called emergency medical personnel to attempt a risky kangaroo leather unsticking procedure, he would certainly assume all the blame. He would be ruined. Even worse, he would never be able to pass Topher Gopher's luxury sofas down to his children. And then he'd really look like an idiot for naming them all Topher Gopher. He did what to his mind was the most logical thing. Using the anonymous Australian host's false nose as a bludgeon, Topher Gopher smashed through the window and entered the mansion. Investigators later determined he snuck up behind the squealing podcaster, wrapped the false nose's rubber strap around his neck, and strangled him to death. He then loaded the kangaroo leather couch with the anonymous Australian host's body still attached into the delivery truck he'd used to drive to the mansion. Authorities can't say for sure, but it's believed by law enforcement that Topher Gopher intended to strip the leather upholstery from the sofa, turn it inside out, and reupholster the sofa with the anonymous Australian host's body still inside. The only evidence of his crime would be the stench of the body slowly decaying inside the home of whatever wealthy person purchased the sofa in the future. But this could easily be explained away as the normal smell given off by authentic kangaroo leather. Whatever his plan, Topher Gopher was never able to follow through on it. The delivery truck was in very poor repair after having been driven across town by a blindfolded driver. After several collisions with other cars, sidewalk mailboxes, telephone poles, and many pedestrians, the truck was barely holding together. As Topher Gopher headed down the second tallest hill in the city, the truck's wheels fell off. Trailing a shower of sparks from its undercarriage as it slid down the street, the truck only came to a stop when it collided with the bottom of the tallest hill next door. At this exact moment, Karen Kilgariff happened to be in her summer mansion recording an episode of her podcast, My Favorite Murder. According to reports, her microphone picked up the distant sound of Topher Gopher's delivery truck exploding at the bottom of the hill, but it was later edited out in post. Ironically for the anonymous Australian host, his own murder was not the only true crime in which he was implicated this night. Authorities later determined that some time before he was killed by Topher Gopher, he placed an order with a local hitman service to eliminate the bank operator he was pretty sure knew his true identity. By later getting strangled to death and blown up in the back of a sofa delivery truck, the anonymous Australian host was able to escape justice for this terrible misdeed, thus having accomplished the perfect true crime. Thank you for listening to Evidence File, presented by Pizzaply Media. I'm your host, an anonymous Australian man. Join me next time for more information about horrible crimes.